And so my name was already in the channel. It was just my name. So I was like, I don't need to have my name on the slides. And now that I get here, I'm like, this says nothing about me. However, I hope that it will be useful. So to kind of give you a quick feel, a flavor for what this is aimed at startups within blockchain. I hope that's obvious. I can't promise that it'll be exciting. I think if you're a founder who's at that place where you want to be raising funds pretty soon, it should be interesting. If you're a builder and you don't care about this, then I can't promise you that this will be any fun. I'll try. So let's go. Oh, and it's not like I'm not giving any financial advice. I'm not telling you which tokens to buy or anything like that or to sell. I'm not going to give legal advice. There is a lot of legal stuff within this overall process of fundraising. I don't want to give you specific advice. I will give you some examples in this presentation of what I've seen, but don't take it as advice. You have to go to a lawyer. So this is me kind of just covering my ass. Oh, and yes, I'm from Edinburgh originally. I was born actually in the hospital, which is no longer here, the Royal Infirmary. Some of you from Edinburgh probably know this one. It was like 200 meters down here. And then they axed it like 20 years ago or whatever. So very much local, but I was away for a number of years. I was working at the Web3 Foundation, which was known for launching Polkadot. You've probably heard of it. I think it's like top 15 by market cap. If you were to take out the stable coins, it might be sort of 10 or 11-ish. More I could say than that, but not in this presentation. I did many roles at the Web3 Foundation. It's almost like you name it and I did it, whether it was events, information security, community management, a whole bunch of stuff. As a startup, everything was kind of everywhere. It was a mess. Things were on fire. And then eventually we sort of figured out some structure and I took on the role of creating the grants program that we had and then managing that for about a year and a half before I left. And I left whenever the product launched. It was a good time to leave. Since then, I've been an advisor to a lot of startups. You probably won't recognize these names. They are small, they are startups. The one that you may have heard about out of all of them potentially is this one here, but probably not Nine Chronicles. It is on DApp Radar. At one point, it was within the top 10 of these blockchain games. But to be honest, you'd be like, oh, why should you believe me? Well, maybe by the end of the presentation, you'll be convinced as to why I know something. If not, you can go and check out these afterwards and see if there's any substance in each of these teams. One of them called Reforged, has some local presence here in Edinburgh around Scotland. 2 of the members are Scottish. It's actually not blockchain, it's more of a traditional gaming startup. They might do something Web3 related in the future, but right now they're not promising it. So this is my model. I don't know if anyone else has a different model, but when I talk to teams, when I advise them, I say, this is how I work. We have 3 phases, 3 rounds of fundraising. The first one is bootstrapping, which I think is pretty familiar to any startup. And then the later one is where you're selling tokens. You could also sell equity. So this sort of meta process is basically the same for any startup. But in my presentation, I'm going to tailor it specifically to blockchain, specifically to selling tokens. And that's tokens of your project, I mean. Grants, so this is obviously where I worked at Web3. This is one that I know pretty well. I think grants are useful. Each of these stages that I'm talking about are optional. You don't have to do any of them. Obviously, it would be very strange for you to launch a token without doing any fundraising, but of course it is possible. So whenever I talk about grants, I'm not saying that you should or that you have to, but I think there are benefits to you doing it. The benefits are, do I talk? Yes, I got it in the middle. I'm jumping the gun. Let me say one of the first things about grants is that it's a small amount of money. It's either about 10K up to about 100,000. You can apply normally multiple times to the same grant program, so you could probably rack up maybe 200K. I don't want to promise you much more than that because often the funders themselves say, you've had a lot of money from us, you got to slow down, you got to figure out your way. If you're taking grant money, there was teams who wanted to be like a consultancy company. Tell us what to build. And it's like, no, you should be a product company, not a consultancy company. So as a startup founder, I think you should be thinking more about building a product rather than a consultancy. If you want to build a consultancy, that's fine, but I would suggest that grants may not be the right way to do it. You can try, of course. With grants, one of the best things for grants for you is it's money which is non-dilutive. So you're not selling any tokens. You're basically given free money in exchange for your labor. You want to build something for the ecosystem, the one that you're targeting, whether it's Cardano or Polkadot or Ethereum or whatever. It might be that you're building a new wallet, and that's something you would basically contribute to the ecosystem. Many of these will ask you to do it open source. I think that's the right way. If you disagree, that's also fine, but I think open source is fine, especially if you're getting free money. It also means that you're forced to think on a problem which is small, which is tangible, and while your project may have some great grand scope or grand vision, that's not really so helpful whenever you want to try to sell that to an investor. If you have this great vision but you haven't built anything, why would an investor want to give you any money? And time and again, it turns out that a lot of investors don't want to. Yes, crypto is crazy, and yes, there are stories of where people will invest in a project that has no product. So I know that it does happen. I'm not going to say that that's like the norm that you should do. So obviously I don't want to encourage that. Oh, and of course where to apply, well, there's the usual faces, Ethereum, Polygon, etc. I don't want to talk too much about that, although I could. So now I want to get into the private rounds. This is kind of the main meat of my presentation. It's probably the most interesting part. In here, I have text in black and text in grey. The text in grey I can't really cover because I don't have enough time, but it is important and I have it in my YouTube videos. But here in the black part, in the black text, is what I'm going to try to cover today. Mostly the valuations part. The next part's down about finding investors in pitch deck. I will mention in a slide, but I can't go into a lot of detail, but I have something. This is the, so this is private sale of tokens. So this is to investors who are so-called sophisticated, VCs, angels. You're selling tokens before they exist, so you're selling an allocation of tokens in tokens that will exist in some future Genesis block or in some future deployed contract, but right now they don't exist. So you have a contract that you would sign with an investor, a SAFT, which is a sale of future tokens, or if you're selling equity, then it's a SAFE rather than a SAFT. In the UK, I think they might call them ASAs, or they used to call them ASAs. You can find an ASA, which is Advanced Subscription Agreement. I signed one recently, but I'm terrible with the names for that. Whenever you're doing this, the seed stage, I should say, okay, there's the first stage is the seed stage, that's your initial stage, and then the later stages, some people call it strategic. It's not an exit, it's just a later stage of a private round before you get to your token launch. So the token launch, the token generation event, TGE, that's going to happen after these have been completed. Again, these are optional. You don't have to do that, but it's pretty unusual for you to launch your product without these. The seed stage, you're looking at roughly 1 year's worth of funding. I mean, obviously it's how long is a piece of string, how much will you need, you don't necessarily know. It's a bit of a guessing game. You're probably looking at 5 to 10 investors, give or take. You may have more. You can have friends, family, and angels, which will contribute, say, like $10,000 a ticket or $20,000 a ticket. That happens. Most typical at this stage is you're meant to go to VCs or angels who have a big enough pocket to afford, say, a ticket at $50,000 or $100,000. And those are not big tickets for VCs. VCs can easily cut $200,000, $300,000, $500,000 tickets. They're just not going to do it at the seed stage. That'll be later, at a later stage. I won't mention strategic stage because I'm going to mention that in a later slide. Oh, yes, I was supposed to talk about investing. Oh, actually, one point I really want to point out. I don't know if you've heard of key opinion leaders. Basically, an influencer. A KOL is something which is really popular in the East, and especially in China. I only learned about it a few years ago. I'm like, what's a KOL? And basically, it's an influencer. And there is this trend within the last year or so for you to specifically put influencers into your early rounds, either to just give them tickets or to somehow let them buy into your project. And I would say don't do that. The return on investment is probably not good. You're going to have an investor who's, in most cases, not sophisticated and most likely will dump your token. That's not to say that influencers can't be useful in terms of marketing and advertising your product. They can be, but you probably want to figure out a deal which could involve some tokens, but I'm reluctant to suggest that you put them in early and for like the best valuation. Oh yeah, so this is about, you've probably heard of Blur. You've probably heard of people looking up tokens, looking up ETH for Blur. This is one of these projects where they did fundraising, you threw money into a contract, but there was no product. So it's not a great example. It's an example of it has happened, but I don't want to suggest that you should. This one, what I wanted to show you was this idea of a cliff. The part here where the tokens are launched at TGE, and then you can see the investors, which is the pinky salmon color, all of a sudden they get tokens at this point here. So it goes from like they get nothing to they get a little bit of something. And that's the cliff. And it's very common for there to be a cliff, that your investors will get tokens, but for the first year they might get nothing, or the first 2 years they might get nothing. But then all of a sudden at some point there's this cliff where it jumps up. They get 10, 20, 30% of their tokens, and then eventually they will have some sort of linear unlocking over the next however many years, could be 3, 4, 5 years. Crypto does things very, very fast, where an unlocking event might be 2 years. What I understand of traditional sort of startups in equity, sort of Silicon Valley, it was more like 8 years, where 5 years was meant to be fast. I'm not an expert in that, so when I quote these numbers, this is what I've heard from other people. Take it with a bit of a pinch of salt. Yes. This is probably the most important slide of the presentation, maybe the most interesting. If you are a startup founder now and you're about to launch, or you want to launch soon, you have to know what is the valuation of your project. And this is some really broad brush valuations. You will be in about these kind of values. The top one there says 15 to 20 million, and that was April to June 2021. I was more active then, I'm less active now. These valuations are basically the same. I asked some friends, what valuations are you seeing? They said, well, in the seed round, you can find it 30 million. My friend decided to pass, and I said, it's a bit too much. And you can find them even at 10 million or less than 10 million. I don't want to promise you that you will. If you're an investor, will you find it less than 10 million? Yes, you can. Will you? Can't promise you. As a founder, you want your valuation in some ways to be as high as possible, but you have to be realistic that you shouldn't push it too high, because then that also is somewhat self-defeating. In the period just before, so this is 2021, so in the period at the end of December, you'll notice that the valuations were slightly lower. And this is a reflection of the fact that the sort of long bear market of crypto, all valuations are depressed. And then in the bull market, they tend to be a bit kind of frothy. Obviously, it's not a huge jump going from 12 to 20 compared to what you might see in the market, where if you look at Blur, it hasn't even launched as a product yet, and it's like $1 billion plus, which to me is kind of wild, but we all know that crypto is a bit kind of wild and probably doesn't make a lot of sense. And that also goes some way to justifying the DeFi L1s and L2s valuations at their seed stage, when they've got maybe almost nothing built. They can be asking for 50 million valuations or 100 million valuations. Is it justified? Only in the sense that the market will pay that. Other investors will pay this because they think, well, I can sell this in a year's down the line and I'll make a 10x. So that's fantastic, I'll do that. Doesn't make it right, but it is what it is. That's the reality. Then you have what they might call a strategic sale. So this is before you've launched your product. This is before you've done your token generation. You may have launched some MVP that people can play with, but this is all before you launch the actual token for your project. You've done your seed stage, you've got some money in, you've been around maybe for a few months, 6 months at least. And then you say, okay, I've only got so much money left, only so much runway, I need to raise some more money. So you go back out and you sell more tokens. You sell more tokens, but you're going to do it at a higher valuation. You're basically saying to investors, well, I've built some product now and I've hired some people, so I must be worth more money now. And that's generally what happens. In the craziness of the bull market of 2021, people were doing follow-up rounds to their seed within like 2 and 3 months, which is wild because you've built almost nothing within 3 months. But then in 2021, the market was wild, and people were like, okay, let's get involved, let's pay, and that's what happened. People would end up doing like 2 or 3 rounds within the space of 12 months, and going valuations from, say, starting at 10 to 15, and then eventually getting to 100 million valuation before they've launched their product, before they've launched the token, all in private rounds. It's crazy, and that's basically what happened. In the bear market, prices are down, the activity is not as fast, and the valuations are not as high. So these are kind of ballpark figures. I know they're about right, but I don't want to oversell it to you. Oh, in terms of the round size, you're going to be selling sort of 5% to 10%, give or take. And so you're looking, and this is a strategic. In the previous, I think I skipped that part of the slide. I think you were, At your seed stage, you're raising, say, 750-ish to about 2 million-ish at most. It's quite common to raise about $1 million and for that to be about a year's worth of money. Hopefully it lasts you longer, but these are kind of like the rough ballpark figures of what they are about from what I've seen. Now, let's suppose you've got a valuation. Maybe you've already spoken to an investor. One of the key points is finding investors. And one of the key points about finding investors is making sure that they can find you. If you've done a grant, there's a good chance that you're on a big list of grants. You go to, like, say, Polygon or Web3, on their website somewhere, there's probably a big list of all the grantees. And all of the investors will be looking for who's the next project that's in line, who else hasn't been invested in. They want to be early. They want to make the big X's. So they want to find you early. And actually, to some hand, it can be annoying. If you're on Telegram, your Telegram will be pinging all the time with people pretending to be investors of various sizes. Like, they might be an angel, but they might not be. Or they might be a VC, but then they might not be. And this is just part of the kind of unfortunate game of crypto. But if you're raising money, you kind of have to deal with this annoyance. You'll be dealing with a lot of phone calls. And yes, you can be dealing with 50 phone calls or 100 phone calls just to raise your seed stage. It sounds pretty terrifying, and it actually sounds kind of painful. And to some extent that it is, but you can get into a rhythm. And so it becomes kind of more natural to you that your first 5 to 10 calls will probably be quite crap and you probably won't get any money from them. But once you get a bit more into the way of it, you'll be much better, you'll be more fluent. So if there's some investors that you really want to raise from, I would almost say don't speak to them first. Send them an email, maybe see if they're interested, but I would say don't go into your very first meeting without having done any sort of preparation or without any trial work, because you don't know if you'll be saying the right things. And you can get all sorts of strange questions that will come out of literally nowhere, where the investor wants to sound smart and they'll maybe try to sort of trip you up, or it'll sound like they're trying to trip you up, but they're probably not. They're probably just asking like a reasonable question, like, why are you not using the latest version of React? You're like, and you can't think of why you're not doing it. And I've seen this come up, and founders kind of, sometimes they flounder where they're looking for the right answer, and then they figure out, and it's like, oh, but the blockchain framework that we're using doesn't use the latest version, and I have to be compatible with that, so therefore I didn't. It happens. So if you have a website, which you should have, a Twitter, a Medium, all of the things which, well, this is obvious, like any startup should have that. But sometimes when I speak to startups, like, they don't want to do it. Oh, I don't want to have a website, it's just a cost. I don't want to have a Twitter, I can't be bothered, I don't have anything to say. But then how is an investor going to find you if you don't have a Twitter or a Medium or any blog or a website? And it sort of putting it off and not doing it is not good for raising money. It is your choice, but I've seen it go negatively against a team who didn't want to. Having a token is also something which will naturally invite investors towards you. If you're a project where you're saying, yeah, we will have a token, you'll have investors all over you like flies to you know what. If you're already a crypto project that doesn't have a token, you're going to be harder to invest in. It's kind of, I'm not going to say that you should have a token, but it does make it harder to be. It's like MetaMask doesn't have a token, but it's owned by consensus. I imagine that most people will have tokens and they will be selling tokens, and that's kind of why I'm here, and probably why you're here. Big lists of investors. So one of these, if you're in the Telegram group, you've probably seen this one called Lighthouse Beacon, which Mathieu just linked, and it's actually quite nice. So there's a few investors on that list that I didn't know of, many that I do, and it's nice that there's filters, so you can basically filter which ones are going to be suitable for your project. There's a list that I made, which is on a Reddit. It's about 100 investors or so of mixed quality, I will be honest. Not all of them are good, so I'm not going to say that you should go to these guys because they're good, they're not. If I was to say like KR1, these people are quite friendly. I've spoken to them, I know who they are, I think they're good. I don't want to promise you that they're the best people ever. If you find some dirt in them, like, okay, sorry. Fabric at the top are also quite good. London, so KR1's UK based, Fabric is UK based. Hypersphere is US, these are people that I used to work with, so I know them. Hashkey, probably reasonable. IOSG, sort of, they're China. Fundamental Labs, China. Fenbushi, China, or China, but actually it's Chinese founders, but they're in Singapore. At least their funds are in Singapore, so you might find that. These investors, regardless of where you are, where you're based, and where your entity is based, they can be happy to invest in your project. So the fact that you are in Scotland as a resident doesn't mean that an investor from Singapore won't invest in your project. To me that's obvious because crypto is global, but it was a question to me earlier this week or last week. Like, But does this apply globally, or what does it matter where I'm based or where my entity is based? Generally, no. And entities is something I would like to talk about, but there's only so much time, and I'm probably running out of time, so I have it in a later slide if I remember. Anyhow, these are the two websites. There are links. There's QR codes. I don't know if you want to scan them with your phone. It might be useful. The top one is definitely in the Telegram group. If you're in the Telegram group, it's definitely there. This presentation, I think, will be made available later. Guys are nodding their heads. So we'll try to make this available to you either in the Telegram group or on the Luma, so you can go and download this presentation later, click the links and everything else, if the QR codes don't work. I hope they work and it's not malware, right? Okay. So let's say that you have some idea about finding investors. The most important part of this whole journey, this whole fundraising journey, is actually the pitch deck. And it's a topic that I should be saying more about, but I kind of cut it short because it's like, okay, I need to cut something. And so I cut this, which is kind of unfortunate. But this is without a doubt the most important part of the entire journey. Your pitch deck should follow these topics. Basically not more and basically not less. And you might say, well, why? Because this is what works. This has been, many teams have been through this process and have basically given a presentation, they've given a pitch deck which is basically this, and it works, it raises money. Can you add more slides? Yes. Can you take some away? Yes, you can. But I know that this one works. What's missing obviously in this is all of the details which is hiding in here. Within this presentation, the most important parts are going to be this part, but then mostly this part. So investors look at, yep. Oh, token distribution. How many tokens am I going to get? What is their valuation? Should they be doing that? Well, of course they should look at it, but should they put all of their emphasis there? No. But sometimes they put too much emphasis there because they're an investor. And so this is the one that you want to get right. Out of all of the slides, get that one right. The other thing is that the presentation, the formatting, really matters. So the color schemes, the graphics, all of that is important. And it's one of these things, if you're an engineer, you may sort of, pew, you might think, oh, it's not really that important, but it is. And it's difficult to convey how important that is until you probably start fundraising and you're like, oh, why am I not raising any funds? Well, it's like, yeah, you made it in Google Docs like I have done. And my presentation it's okay, it's not great. I'm probably not going to raise any money with this. If you can afford a graphic designer to do the work, I would strongly recommend it. It is a cost. Obviously, if someone quotes you 20 grand, then tell them to take a hike. But if you can find someone who can do it for a reasonable amount, even with a little bit of graphical work, then it is definitely worth doing. You want to raise money and you want to convince an investor that you're serious about doing it. So if you give them some sort of messy presentation which has got too much text and it looks like you've not really paid much attention to detail in terms of like the layout of all of your boxes, then you do make it that much harder for the investor to say yes. They see so many presentations that when they get to yours and you've got this complete mess, they're like, nah, and they're going to skip. It's just a practical reality, to be honest. I think try to get it right. And I know it's easy for me to say that. What you can do is you can look for presentations online that other teams have done and try to hone yours and try to kind of copy and emulate what they've done, or ask someone who's done it before, like another founder, ask them or ask myself. I have this template here. It's in Google Docs. It's a template in the sense that it's got all of these inside with some of my comments. What I don't do is give you a nice, I don't give you a lot of details. It's something that I'm working on. I'm actually working on a sort of mock presentation where I give some details, but right now, this one is rather rough, but it's a starting point. Oh, and obviously the QR code in the bottom corner if you want to get access, but it should be available later. So that was the private rounds. That was probably the most important part. This part might be maybe I was saying that the private part was probably the most interesting, but then maybe this part is the most interesting part, where you're actually giving out the token. Yeah, here we have the Benjamins, and it's probably where you have the highest valuations and therefore the highest amount of money. The problem is that selling tokens publicly is a bit of a legal minefield. There's so much regulations that it's just a general headache. And that's why I'm going to say that this is not legal advice. I'm going to give you some examples of what I've seen before, but I'm not going to tell you that you should do this. It's kind of on you to figure it out, to find a lawyer, and to get clued up. If you are American, you potentially want to just ignore this. If you're going to be based in America in the near future, you should probably ignore this until the US decides to change its law. So you may or may not know that the SEC considers all ICOs to be investment contracts. So not your token, but the actual sale of your token is the investment contract. So your token could be a pure utility token or a pure payment token, but the SEC doesn't care. The fact that you've sold your token in public is what would make it a security for them. If you're not based in the US, you might say that's fine. And to some extent, it is. But if you ever want to get on a plane and visit the US, yeah, there's a chance you'll be detained. So it's difficult to make this recommendation, oh, yes, you should definitely do an ICO, or you should definitely do a public sale. There's a lot more nuance to it than that. And I definitely can't cover all of the nuances here. So I just want to give you this broad warning. The US may also be changing things in terms of, my vague understanding is that the SEC may no longer be the regulator, it may be the CFTC. The CFTC is about futures and, someone help me out, commodities. Yes, commodities and futures. And they may be more lenient. They may say, you know what, it's not really securities, it's just blockchain tokens, it's decentralized, blah, and then it's fine. I think in terms of like Bitcoin and Ethereum are not securities and everything's been like, yeah, it's fine, let's have ETFs and everything. But for you as a new project, there's no way that I can really promise that. So this is some general warnings, especially about the US. Like, don't sell to Americans, maybe American VCs, and this is the tricky one. So some VCs, some big investors will not invest in your project if there's American investors because they're worried about the legal risks. Even if your entity is based in the Cayman Islands. It is a pain, but that's kind of the landscape. So I would say, speak to the investors that you're interested in, see if they're happy with that, see if they have recommendations. They might say, you know what, go to Cayman Islands, it's fine. You're going to be taking sophisticated American investors, therefore it wasn't a public sale, therefore it's fine. And maybe that's fine. I have seen it, and I know teams have raised from Americans, and it does happen. Americans have a lot of money. Surprise, surprise. Silicon Valley has a lot of money. And so if you were to tell me, yeah, I found lots of American investors, well, that's not really a surprise because there's a lot of money in America. It is what it is. Now, why do you want to do a public token sale or a public token disbursement? Well, decentralization is one. If you have all of the tokens, obviously it's not decentralized. I mean, obviously you know that. The other things are around user loyalty. If a user has a token, obviously I think everyone knows here, if some of you may even be maxis yourself, hopefully not. It is important. People will like to be part of something, whether it's football or religion or, you know, the Bitcoin community. It's something which is in itself is valuable to you because they then become your evangelists to try and bring in more people. And that helps with the network effects, which I hopefully said I did. And obviously user acquisition. Another caution here is if you're talking about your token, you can't promise that your token will go up in value. It maybe should be obvious, and you probably know by now that if you're in the telegram of some public project that they'll maybe not talk about prices at all, and that's because lawyers basically tell you don't talk about it. A lot of this is US driven, but it's not only US driven. So if you're saying, yeah, number will go up, you put yourself into this difficult place where the SEC could come and kick your ass. And that's why I don't recommend that you do it. Yes, there are teams that do it, and even one of the teams that I've been working with that I advised them not to say anything about token price, and maybe they did. What can I do? I can only advise people what I think is right. It doesn't mean that they will listen to me. That's kind of the thing of being an advisor. Oh, yes. I'm reading this as I go. I'm like, oh, now I remember. Your public price, don't make it too much higher than the private price. Sure, you could set it for $1 billion and you yourself could be wealthy, and that might be great for you, but it can leave a very bad taste in the mouth of the community whenever they get their tokens and all of the big investors decide to dump the tokens. They've made at least a 10x or more, and it's like, oh, I made lots of money. it depresses the price, and so anyone who's bought the token, say, at $1 billion, now has a depressed price as it cuts in half, and that's generally bad for. It's bad for the community, which then becomes bad for you whenever you get death threats. You still want to work in crypto? Death threats are fun. I've had them myself, and it wasn't even my fault. So I was working with one team. They had a token sale. Someone got upset because the mechanics of the token sale was not entirely clear. I'm like, oh, what happened? And then I got explained to me by a community member, and it's like the token price would ratchet upwards in the public sale. I'm like, oh, and now the valuation crept up to billions of dollars because of the way that the token pricing mechanism worked. I'll be honest, that is not my favorite pricing mechanism. You can set your pricing mechanism to be whatever you want. And so you have a lot of freedom to do it, but that doesn't mean that you should do it. You could say, oh yes, by the end of the sale, the valuation will be $10 billion, and that sounds great because you yourself may be very rich. I just want to caution against that greed. The other thing is the liquidity, that even if you have a very high valuation, the liquidity of your token may be very low, such that it crashes very quickly. So there are many, many, many things to be aware of, and obviously I can't cover them all, but I want to discourage you from some of the sort of nastier, griftier aspects of crypto, which is hard because I know people are often really drawn to it, and it's like, please don't. So possible strategies, and I'm guessing I'm probably talking to people who already know these strategies. I've probably already heard of them. You've almost certainly heard of an airdrop. Even if you've only been in crypto for a couple of months, you've probably heard of an airdrop. You may not have heard of a lock drop or a stake drop. It is basically an airdrop, but there's a little bit of extra anti-Sybil mechanisms in there where, for example, you lock up some ETH and you get some token on the other side. It's not a sale, all you're doing is locking up. And that's like an anti-Sybil mechanism. It's not perfect. I'm not a huge fan of these, but people do them. The kind of off the record comment I would give, some people do these as a way to kind of play the regulatory arbitrage game, which is, well, our project is really decentralized. I've given out all of these tokens, so 60% of our tokens are in the hands of the community, so we're decentralized. But then 60%, let's say, of the community who are holding the tokens, but they're not coherent. So whenever they vote upon something, if you have governance and voting, and it could be sort of 60% which don't vote in the same direction, then let's say you own 30% for whatever reason, you're going to be taking your 30% and pushing in one particular direction. So a lot of the decisions can be pushed in your favor, which is good and bad. There's a longer conversation there. So this kind of game of, hey, we're really decentralized because we're giving out lots of tokens, is one that crypto founders will pay. And I'm not saying that you should or you shouldn't. I'm saying be aware of it and that there's pros and cons to that. Like, you should be decentralized and you should figure out a way to get your tokens into the hands of the community. But like everything, it swings around a bit. Sometimes there's good things, sometimes there's bad things. Some investors might say, get yourself listed onto an exchange. And you think, oh, that makes a lot of sense. I should be listed on an exchange. Every big project is on Binance. Every big project is on Kraken and Coinbase. Why shouldn't I? And to some extent, you should. The thing that you won't be aware of unless you've done it is that getting listed on an exchange invites literally thousands of people to join your Discord and harass you about token prices. You still want to work in crypto? So apart from the death threats, you have all the GM messages. And apart from all the GM messages, you have when price going up. That'll be daily. And as soon as you get listed on an exchange, it will be all the time. It'll be 24/7 people asking you, devs, do something, why is price not going up? And yeah, can I discourage you from doing that? No. Should I? No. Should I encourage it? Also no. Yeah, so coming down from the top part is like, they're not sales, this is you giving out tokens one way or other. Participation. You can have public sales, which you probably know these, I'm guessing if you're already crypto savvy. ICOs, which were personally my favorite, I like them. IDOs, where you do it on a DEX. Most of them have been shady. That's not to say that all of them should be shady, but many of them have. Then you have an initial exchange offering where you go to Binance and you say, launch my token. Not a fan of those myself, but yes, you can do it. You can also do all three of these. You can do a combination of all of them if you want. One of the ones I did like was this one. So this is my friend Bruno, had the project called Remark. This is his token. Don't buy it, don't sell it, no recommendations at all. An NFT ICO. So he sold some NFT art, which he said, okay, well, you're going to get some tokens in the future and you're going to have some NFT art and there'll be maybe a game associated with this maybe in the future, or we'll do something. I quite like that. Not necessarily that you should do a game or that games are necessary, but I like the fact that it was more like a Kickstarter. You're getting in early, you're getting a good valuation, you're doing it publicly. So one of the things about not doing a private round is that you're basically scraping away all of the VCs and all of the angels and going straight to the public, which feels kind of more in the spirit of crypto. The downside of doing that is that you jump into the cauldron much faster of everyone saying GM, everyone saying when's price going up, and everyone giving you death threats whenever it doesn't go up. This is the duality of being in crypto. It's the duality of being, do you go to private investors first, which is easier and more pragmatic, but then also not really in the spirit of crypto, or do you go with the people who are in the public, which is in the spirit of crypto, but then much more personal headache for yourself? It's difficult for me to give advice on that, but that's kind of the reality. The other things which you may have heard of, DICO, this was Vitalik who mentioned this, and then liquidity bootstrapping protocols, liquidity bootstrapping pools, such as Balancer. I am not an expert on that, but I believe that the mechanism for LBPs, at least the one that I saw, was actually quite similar to Polkadot, which I have on the next slide. This was an ICO that I liked, not just because I was working at the project. Ask me about the project later, but the ICO I thought was nice in that it didn't have a predetermined valuation, that the valuation was basically determined by the market. And I think LBPs do something pretty similar. So the price or the market value starts very high on day one, this is time, and then over time the market cap will follow some predetermined curve, which is something roughly minus exponential. So the market cap comes down, and whenever the market cap comes down enough, you might want to buy in. You're like, oh, this looks like a good valuation for me, so I'll buy in. And so you have the amount of tokens contributed here in ETH, and so the market cap of the tokens which are contributed at some point will meet this price when it comes down. And they'll meet at some point, and that's what will determine the price. There's some extra funky mechanism, second price, so it wasn't like the very last price, but the price before the last price, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter. The overall shape is what was important. And I really liked this as a mechanism for an ICOs, and most ICOs didn't do this, even though I like this sort of mechanism. They sold 50% of their Genesis block. Is that right? Maybe. It meant they could then sell more tokens later as they needed to build and then sell more. I couldn't tell you that this is like the magic right number. It's like you should probably try and figure it out for yourself. See what works. Look what other teams are doing. What else did I have? Oh, I'm more or less ending. So I had to cut a lot of information from this presentation. I may have gone slightly over time, but maybe it's okay. I have this presentation on YouTube, but it's actually 4 videos. And I give more detail in those videos that I can't give here. Things like intellectual property I mention. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't say this is definitively what it is. But what I do say is like, these are things that I've seen. Where should you have your IP? Should you have it in Switzerland or in Germany or in the UK? I can't give you an answer for that as you know, in some sort of legal answer. What I can say is like, this is what I've seen from teams. Here's some of the pitfalls, the nuances. Think on it yourself, because there is a lot of headaches in there if you have your IP, say, in the UK versus Switzerland versus the Caymans, whether you own the IP as a person or whether it's owned by the company. It's a whole minefield. Then also, where should your company be based? Should it be a company, or should it be a foundation or an association? Should it be in Cayman or British Virgin Islands or Switzerland or Malta, Gibraltar? I've seen all of those, and I don't want to give recommendations. I would say that what's common is Switzerland is one of the most common. It's also one of the most expensive. It is possibly the most prestigious and probably the most trustworthy. If I said I had a company in Caymans, you might think, is that dodgy? Well, it's not, but it just sounds dodgy because it sounds like it's Caymans and people have this negative association. It is what it is, it's crypto. Singapore's good, Hong Kong maybe not so much. Singapore's getting harder. It's not impossible, but it's still good. Then you have like your Maltas, Gibraltars, which are cheaper. possible, just less prestigious. And then what's very popular is BVI and Caymans, partly because they're cheaper than Switzerland, and the rules and regulations are a little bit more relaxed. It's not completely wild cowboy territory, and I say that even though the FTX had entities in like the Bahamas or whatever else. It is what it is. So I cover some of that in the videos, I should say, and there's a lot of other details, other things which may or may not be interesting. So the videos is one place to go to. That's this QR code, as you can read. I put a blog onto Grail, which is part of Subsocial, which is one of these decentralized social media sites. I covered most of what I talked about here in that blog, if you want to read rather than watch. And then one which I thought was interesting is Kobe on Twitter, crypto Twitter. He has this good blog about private capture. He talks a little bit about valuations in there, and a little bit about the dangers of overvaluing your project, and also a little bit about like the liquidity of, you can set the valuation to be very high, but then only release a small amount of tokens. He kind of talks about some of the problems with the dynamics of doing that. And I think it's a really good blog and one worth reading. My own website, which does look a bit kind of crap, but it is what it is, it's there. And then, yeah, these are the QR codes. I feel like I could say a lot more, because I talk about this one a lot and it's quite a passionate topic of mine. So, I don't really have anything else to do. That was like my end, but I'm happy to take questions